So this is the second part of the morning session, and we're a little bit behind schedule. But of course, it's very important that we dedicate enough time to this particularly important session. And we're very honored to have Pierre Sauvé with us, and who will give a very important introductory talk linked to the theme of services and international trade. And as you can see behind, the title of his talk is Tackling Impediments to Services, Lessons from Practice. And Pierre has been supporting us, the REDLAS network, for already several years. And just to give you a very short introduction on who is Pierre. Pierre Sauvé is the Director of Program Development and a faculty member of the World Trade Institute at the University of Bern in Switzerland. He also serves as an academic advisor and faculty member of the University of Barcelona's LLM program in International Economic Law and Policy, IELPO, and he's also a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges, in Belgium. Pierre has worked in different organizations. He's been a trade negotiator for Canada, has worked several years at the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in the Trade Directorate, and has a long-standing career in the issues he will discuss today. So, Pierre, we're very honored you're here. We're very honored of all the support you've given us to the REDLAS network, in part through editing 2 books that have come out of papers that have been presented at different meetings. And we hope to count on your future support as well for the network. And I would like to give the floor to you and just shorten 5 minutes of your initially planned 30 minutes talk, so we can also leave space for the other presenters later on. And thank you again for being with us.
It's very unfair that I would be a victim, the collateral victim of time constraints, if I look at how time was managed in the previous panel. But anyway, I'm going to, with your permission, make this presentation in French-Canadian because I can speak much, much faster, if that's okay. If the interpreters are fine with this. They're not. Okay, so I'll stick to English. I'll stick to English and maybe cut down on the jokes, maybe just get down to business. Nana was very kind in saying I've been around for a long time. Another way of saying it is Pierre is old, which I am, actually. I am in my, if you can believe it, and you have to because I'm saying it, I am in my 7th decade of existence. Do the math. It's a puzzle. It's a math puzzle. I'm not necessarily in my 70s, although I am in my 7th decade of existence on this planet Earth. So I've been around for a while, and I think I've been around for the entire journey so far of services as an object of economic diplomacy. We heard at the very beginning of this conference yesterday that services have been around for quite some time, that Jesus Christ himself was one of the first top service providers in the world. And indeed, the first generation of cross-border service providers were preachers, were people who were spreading the gospel, whatever the gospel was, whatever the religion was. Shipping goods overseas has been with us for quite some time, dating back to the Phoenicians over the Mediterranean. So services as an object of daily lives has been around with us since times immemorial. But it's quite remarkable that given the size of the sector, given the importance of services to daily lives, not only now, but since man has been man, it's only in the last 3 decades that we have been really discussing services as an object of international economic governance. And that 3-decade-long journey, if you want, is one that I have been very closely associated with almost since the very start. So when I say lessons from practice, yeah, there is some legitimacy to my ability to draw lessons from practice because I've practiced almost every aspect of this journey, and I've done so from every conceivable angle as a negotiator, as an advisor, as a member of international secretariats, and so on and so forth. And it's been a very rich and very interesting journey. So taking stock is not so difficult. It's projecting in the future that is more difficult. And when I listen to the presentations made in the previous session, you measure the extent of the disconnect between the world of policymaking and the sort of time warp in which policymakers operate, the difficulties they have to engage in conversations that lead anywhere in real time, and the speed with which, actors in the real economy, companies, private investors are operating. And you wonder, does policy make any difference? Does it matter? I'm glad I'm close to retirement because my answer is probably it doesn't. Probably 30 years of work in this area has not made much of a difference. Anyway, so I'm going to try to take stock of the past and also maybe speak to some aspects of the future. What does the future of services trade hold? Although I realize that predicting the future is much harder. I was reading a very funny joke in the Financial Times on the plane taking me here on Monday. There was a woman who went to see a palm reader, a gypsy palm reader, to know about her future. And so she shows her hand, and the palm reader looks at her hand and expresses concern and says, "Oh my God, I see your husband dying a violent death very soon." And so the woman says, "Oh, wow. Can you dig a bit deeper to tell me if I'm going to be acquitted?" So I'm going to try to be acquitted for the insanities I say about the future of services trade. It's not easy to predict where things are going, especially since things seem to be going at a pace that is so fast that it's extraordinarily difficult for policymakers to keep up with the Joneses. Okay, let me make a few contextual considerations, just set some parameters in motion as I start. And of course, the first point I've already made. But from that first point, I draw a number of important inferences that shape how we should be looking at policy, at the pace at which policy is made, at the nature of policy making, and the traction it has in shaping ways of world commerce. And because services as a subject matter of international economic governance is so relatively new, really we never had a conversation about this issue until about 3 decades ago. Because that is a relatively novel space, a short time span in the history in the grand scheme of things, the way in which policymakers approach services trade and services rulemaking is still laden, I would argue, with tremendous doses of precaution, of regulatory precaution. And the reason for that is pretty simple to observe, because the subject matter of international discussions on services is all about, almost exclusively about, behind-the-border domestic regulatory measures. And we know from experience in the realm of non-tariff measures negotiations how much more complicated it is to dismantle impediments to trade and investment that are embedded in domestic regulation rather than in a price instrument like a tariff. It's relatively easy to dismantle border impediments when they take the form of tariffs. We can come up with complex mathematical formula to do so, and that's what we do in market access negotiations. But the currency of discussions and services is of an altogether very different nature. It's my regulation and all that underpins it, all the political economy of rent-seeking, of interest groups and so on that shape, of geography, of history, of language, of culture, of religion. Our regulatory regimes are the way they are because history and context matters, and you don't dismantle history and context easily, and you certainly rarely do that at the request of a trading partner. however big that partner is. Uncle Sam can come to town and says, I don't like the way your banking sector is regulated, change it. Chances are you're not going to change it. That's not how reform in services takes place, and therefore that's not how negotiations in services take place. So the relative novelty of services discussion breeds precaution. Government officials are by definition cautious people. They are not paid to take risks. They tend to be quite satisfied with preserving the status quo. And so we should not be surprised that the footprint of trade diplomacy so far in services is not altogether overwhelming. I often tell my students the multilateral order we have in services, which is embedded in the General Agreement on Trade and Services, that was like a first date in services. It was. And you know from experience, everyone in this room who's been on a date, and I'm sure everyone in this room has been on a date, and I'm talking especially to the guys, because the guys bear a certain extra responsibility in typically initiating the date. Nothing happens on the first date most of the time. The whole purpose of the first date is to get a second date. And so we only had one date in services multilaterally. We have been very promiscuous in preferential contexts, but we have been very monogamously boring multilaterally. Only one date. We're still waiting to conclude the second date in the Doha round. So again, we need to always contextualize and see how many opportunities have we had to really tackle these issues, which are complex, regulatory in character, in a negotiating setting. And the answer is not that much. Sorry, I'm running behind schedule here. Now, we've also, because of precaution, those of you who follow the world of rulemaking will know that we actually transpose that precaution in the very design of rulemaking. We design treaties with a view to not put too much pressure on societies to change. We exercise caution. We provide enormous flexibility and policy space for governments not to be pushed around too much in trade negotiations. So that precaution translates into an architecture of rules that is really in services more than in other areas of rulemaking and trade governance, more inclined to preserve regulatory autonomy, more inclined to protect regulatory sovereignty. And if that's the case, then again, we shouldn't be surprised that dismantling barriers to trade and investment in services is an exercise in frustrating slow motion, because that's the nature of the beast. If you are in a hurry, if you have a temperament that requires rapid movement and rapid progress, my advice to you would be maybe consider a topic other than trade and services, because you're going to be negotiating in super slow motion. It doesn't mean the journey is not interesting. Actually, I would argue services negotiations are among the most challenging negotiations in trade governance, but they proceed because of their very nature in a very slow, ponderous way. Let me make a few more contextual observations, which I think are important. And we've heard about that, especially in the context of digital discussions today and yesterday. Services, unlike goods, are increasingly, as they become digitized, indifferent to matters of time and space and distance and gravity and so on. And of course, that distinguishes services from goods in a very significant way. Reducing trade costs in services is probably relatively easier for many services, to the extent that we trade in services in zeros and ones, where the costs of transmitting data and knowledge is extraordinarily low. Another contextual consideration that I think is important is that the minimum efficient scale of competitiveness is dramatically lower in services because the amount of capital needed, we heard from micro entrepreneurs, single people having great ideas and developing them into profitable businesses, the scale of service production is altogether very dramatically different from that of manufacturing. And that is typically good news. That's good news especially for small firms, and it's good news for developing countries who have much greater ease at lower levels of capital with less equity, with less, all you need is, the intangible asset of a great idea to be able to nurture the growth of a company. It doesn't mean that services do not respond also like manufacturing to agglomeration economies. Yes, if you have a great idea in the middle of nowhere in South Sudan, I would think your prospects of growing your company are not as great as having the same idea in Palo Alto or in Sao Paulo. So let's not go too far, but clearly the scale economies of services are very, very different. So the border is not as material, and the nature of trade is quite different. Where the border remains a hostile place is for things like the mobility of people, mode 4, as we call it in services. Every time we cross a border, I don't know how you feel, but every time I cross a border and I have to talk to a customs agent or an immigration officer, I feel guilty of some crime I have not committed. What is the purpose of your trip? It's like an aggression. Sorry, can I come, please? To do business and to spend money in your country? To provide expertise to your students? Mode 4 remains very weakly liberalized because countries tend to be hostile towards foreign workers and foreign people more broadly. And the border remains also pretty hostile to cross-border transportation. It's amazing that in a world in which 85–90% of trade is shipped by plane and especially by boat, these are two of the sectors of the service economy that are perhaps the least liberalized of all. So the border remains important for some important forms of trade. And if we take mode 4 and transportation, these are probably sectors in which a lot of developing countries have a comparative advantage, and they are being denied opportunities to grow their economies based on the exploitation of those comparative advantages, simply because in some sectors we still have borders to worry about. I need a screen here. It's very unnerving to have to look back. No, I don't like to stand. I feel good right here in the middle of the room. Is that okay? Okay. A few more contextual considerations, which I think are, again, extremely important in understanding the political economy of services and how it differs, perhaps, from goods negotiations. I would say most reforms in service markets, if you just look around the world, they result not from trade diplomacy, they result from domestic conversations on where is the economy going and where is the political equilibrium in favor of change. The Costa Rican example of using trade diplomacy to break up the telecoms monopoly or the insurance monopoly is a complete outlier. You are a freak. Most countries don't do it that way. But Costa Rica had a domestic status quo gridlock that needed to be broken, and the political system was unable to break it internally. External pressure was then used to do that. But in most countries, the process of change that leads to the progressive lifting of barriers to trade and investment in services, proceeds from domestic conversations. And so the role of trade diplomacy, in my experience, is what my friend Aditya Mattu once described as a periodic harvester of unilateral benevolence. This is very poetic, very Aditya, if you know the guy. He's Indian, of course. Indians are prone to forms of lyricism that are extreme, almost poetic. But that's the nature of the game. Unilateralism is the driving force in service sector reforms for the most part. And trade agreements give us opportunities, moments in time, to lock in that virtue, wholly, in part, today, tomorrow, and so on. And then countries differ in the extent to which, in the manner in which they seek to use trade diplomacy for purposes of locking in domestic reform, of locking in future governments to the priorities of the current government, and so on. So I think that observation is a bit of a sobering one. In a way, trade diplomacy locks in a series of domestic conversations. So what matters really from the perspective of the global or regional or national contestability of services markets is what is going on internally or regionally. That is where the action is for the most part. And again, I would say my observation from practice is that reforms in services that are meaningful do not occur in a policy vacuum. They tend to occur in settings in which not only trade and investment are being used, but also competition law domestically. You will not have significant, meaningful, durable liberalization of services markets without an activist set of either pro-competitive regulatory regimes or, more important still, in my view, competition law. But competition law in most countries is a joke. No? We have competition laws, but we don't really use it. Because if we used it, we would be challenging friends of the president, very powerful families. I come from a country, Canada, that had the world's first antitrust law a year before the Sherman Act in the United States was enacted. And we sort of discovered that we had a competition law. So it was drafted in the 1860s. And we discovered we had that law in the 1980s, in the mid-1980s, when we negotiated an FTA with the United States, and the government said, you know, Canada is fat, overweight, uncompetitive. We need to shake up our economy. And all of a sudden, we began to use competition law to challenge all of these oligarchs that we had in our service sectors. So I would say the pace of domestic unilateral reform in service markets is going to be very much determined by market structure and the ability of competition law to break down oligarchic behavior. And, you know, we had a panel yesterday where Brazil was described in rather oligarchic terms. And those oligarchies have, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, often stood in the way of meaningful service sector reforms. In an economy of this size, oligarchs feel very comfortable in their domestic market. They don't need to go outside very much. But of course, they don't want foreigners to contest domestic rents either. The point I'm making is that trade diplomacy alone is not going to do the job meaningfully in most settings. A few more observations. And Nano, please tell me when I'm running out of time. Probably I have already ran out of time, but 10 minutes? Good. I think I can cover most of what I want to cover. Where am I here? That's done already? Okay, when we talk about, because I've been asked, the reason I'm talking about these things is because REDLAS asked me to talk about these things. Talk about the nature of barriers to trade and investment in services. They typically come in three guises. There are three types of barriers that we as negotiators, people interested with public policy in services in a trade setting, are concerned with. Measures that are explicitly discriminatory in nature. We favor Brazilian against all other suppliers. And we've devised a principle of trade liberalization called the national treatment principle that is targeted at progressively or fully eliminating the nature of discrimination. The second, much more difficult type of restriction are restrictions that are rooted in limits on the quantity of competition. And here is where the law of services trade differs dramatically from the law of goods trade. In goods trade, we say quotas are bad by definition and they are banned by definition. They are prohibited by law. In services, you can maintain as many quotas as you like in sectors in which you are willing to discuss market opening measures, so long as you list and maintain them in a transparent way. So we have very different logics of liberalization between services and goods, and we maintain a lot of quotas. There shall be only 4 mobile phone licensing operators. There shall be X number of taxi licenses, and so on and so forth. If you start looking at service sectors, you will find a lot of quantity-based restrictions to competition. Again, leading to market concentration. Most service sectors in most countries are highly oligopolistic in nature. You know, we just heard from the previous panel a bit of sort of, I would say, IT fetishism. You know, the love of technology, and technology is great, but if you look at the IT sector around the world, it's a winner-take-all economy in which large firms completely dominate the landscape. And with market shares that in other traditional industries would immediately raise anti-competitive, antitrust alarm bells. But competition law seems to be on holiday in the digital sphere. And I'm puzzled by that. So we need to focus on market structure, on market share, and understand the political economy that lies behind it if we want to understand how, when, in what way our country is prepared to come to the table and negotiate. And then the third category of restrictions, extremely difficult as well, are restrictions that are rooted in regulation that is non-discriminatory in nature. But the way in which it's drafted or applied or enforced obviously tilts the playing field in favor of some over others. Or we design regulations in such a way to make them disguised restrictions to trade. Or we design them in manners that are clearly excessive, disproportionate. But because they are non-discriminatory, putatively non-discriminatory, they're extraordinarily difficult to challenge. And governments are not willing to, have not been willing so far to come up with legal norms that would help us to challenge regulatory measures that are non-discriminatory but nonetheless excessive and therefore restrictive of trade and investment. That remains a sort of taboo topic in trade diplomacy. Measures are supposed to be no more burdensome than necessary to fulfill a legitimate public policy objective, but no one wants to define what is necessary. And as a result, there's tremendous flexibility in the use of regulation as an instrument of protection. Let me say a few more words on the how we liberalize service markets. And I said earlier, in goods negotiations, we use formulas, market access negotiations. Developing countries reduce their tariffs by an average of 12.5%. OECD countries will drop by 19.5%, or we break it down by sector or by tariff line. It's a mathematical exercise with very complex formula. You cannot do that in services. You cannot say, I want your telecoms regime to be 12.4% less restrictive in 2 years. How am I going to do that? It's just not feasible because the nature of the impediment is it's not a border tariff, it's a domestic regulatory regime. You can't dismantle it using mathematical formula. And of course, some economists, you know, heroic people as they are, try to assign a tariff equivalent to domestic regulatory measures. But I haven't met a trade negotiator in services who takes any of that nonsense seriously. We just don't negotiate the same way. And maybe because most negotiators are lawyers, they don't pay attention in any event to what economists do. But again, there are profound differences that lead to very significant differences in how we tackle the dismantling of border measures. So there are clear limits to reciprocal bargaining, and not surprisingly, there are clear limits to formula-based liberalization in services. It's very difficult. The only areas where you could apply a formula is where you have quantitative restrictions that are similar across countries. If every country in the world, for example, in aviation, limits foreign ownership to, say, 25%, which is not far from the truth, we could all go from 25 to 49. That would be a formula-based approach. But most impediments to trade and services do not lend themselves easily to formulaic liberalization. So, difficult to move forward. Then, of course, some sectors are just too sensitive, can't touch, can't go there. I'm sorry. I come from Canada. We cannot discuss audiovisual services. We won't liberalize our markets for film and broadcasting. Part of the reason is that US market share in the Canadian market is already 95%. Can we keep 5? And the Americans would say, well, no. We want 100% of your market. And then we say, please go and play golf. It's not going to happen. We're going to keep 5%. So we don't discuss it. And Europeans don't discuss it. And Koreans don't discuss it, and so on and so forth. So there are some sectors where sensitivities, for whatever reasons, which often are legitimate, other times are pure rent-seeking reasons. We keep that 5% because that 5% is worth a lot to Canadian actors and singers and movie makers and so on. There are rent-seeking imperatives for protection, let's be honest. If you negotiate with the United States, they cannot pronounce the word maritime. They won't go near maritime. It's a sector of absolute protectionist capture. Health and education, 2 of the most fast-growing sectors in world services trade, never discussed in trade negotiations. And maybe, so what? So what? What's the problem? Trade is occurring and trade is growing. But there are policy sensitivities that mean that a lot of impediments to trade and investment in a large number of sectors, maritime, aviation, health, education, energy, what else? Is there anything left? Audiovisual, professional services. How many countries honestly have negotiated mutual recognition agreements? Every treaty says thou shalt do that, but nobody does that. Because professions are guilds that protect their members and don't want. We all want to export our services, but foreigners in our market? Are you kidding? No way, Jose. I'm not talking about San Jose. But no way San Jose too. Costa Rica is no exception to this rule. So we have to accept, again, I go back to my previous point, a lot of trade will take place in the absence of a governance structure simply because governments are unwilling to do much about the removal of these barriers. The world goes on and we encounter new barriers all the time. I saw this trend last week in Geneva at the WTO Public Forum. I wish it were a graph depicting the evolution of my bank account over the years. But it's not the case. Actually, it would look very differently. It would be sort of downward sloping for the most part because my kids are all in college right now, so I'm in a very deep dip. But this is the rise of digital protectionism, a very recent phenomenon. Countries are discovering ways of actually impeding this juggernaut of e-commerce and digital trade by forcing companies to localize servers and equipment in their territories. Some of that is pure protectionism. Some of it is very complicated, legitimate questions of boundaries. Who owns the cloud? Where are the borders of the cloud? How do you tax cloud-based computing transactions? we tend to idolize digital markets, but there are some real issues that will require some laws, some regulations. Every day we discover a new scandal of digital accounts being stolen, cybersecurity being baffled, and so on. We need governance for these areas. It may not all take the form of trade governance, but Yahoo, 500 million accounts being stolen, it was known last week. So how do we address barriers in the digital era? And I think the biggest battle, which nobody seems to be talking about, will be the looming clash between freedom of trade, which requires the elimination of boundaries, and the need for taxation, which requires territoriality. And trust me, whenever tax and trade collide, who wins? Tax. The Minister of Finance prevails over the Minister of Trade every time. So expect some of this protectionism, whether it's legitimate or not, whether it's disproportionate or not, to be around for some time, because the stakes are very big. Almost finished, Nano. Investment. I said yesterday in response to Alexandros' presentation that we should not forget that 2/3 of world trade and services takes place not through cross-border exchange, but through investment. And we have another world of treaty making in the form of bilateral investment treaties and preferential agreements that regulate cross-border investment that are actually more powerful instruments of protection and liberalization often than trade agreements are. And so a lot of the job of dismantling impediments to trade in services is actually occurring below the radar screen of investment policy making. A lot of people don't seem to be aware of that, or to be sufficiently aware of the degree to which investment law is much more powerful than trade law tends to be. I'm going to make a few more points, if that's okay. I'm going to be like the previous speaker who said, one more video. This is my last video. And this is my next to last video. And have just a few more slides. Because, let's be honest, this is so incredibly interesting, no? Canadians are so humble. Let me say a quick word about services and GVC dynamics, a very important theme, again, of this conference and of REDLAS work for quite some time. And clearly, we are in the midst of the emergence of a new geography of trade and investment in which services are so deeply embedded in everything that is exchanged. And of course, in terms of political economy, that has completely changed the nature of the conversation on services. When I joined the GATT Secretariat in 1987, I believe, was anyone born in 1987? Okay. I teach to students, some of them were not born, and I say, get out of the room. I hate that. Were you born in 1987? Huh? Get out of here. Go and have some coffee. You don't. So, when we began the discussion on services, this was all about, can I export? And if I can, I'm interested in negotiations. And if I'm not a major exporter, I should stay away from the negotiations. And the GVC revolution is forcing us to look at services not as final products, important as they are, but as inputs into the production of other goods and services. It totally transforms the political economy of the conversation. I have an interest in promoting the efficiency with which services are produced in my economy, regardless of whether I am exporting services in any significant increment. And I think that's good news for the liberalization of service markets, and I think that more than anything has been driving unilateral liberalization. The puzzle is, why is that not locked into trade treaties? For that, you need to talk to a political scientist, a political economist. It's just not happening in legally binding forms, but it's happening through unilateral reform. And I think that is the magic of the value chain revolution. Then anything we can do, therefore, because services are so profoundly embedded in the final value of goods that are exported, and 80% of world trade continues to be trade in goods for the most part on a balance of payments basis, anything you do to dismantle impediments to goods, anything you do at the border to facilitate trade and reduce trade costs is going to be a major boost to service economy efficiency and to derived service exports. So I think the GVC revolution, we're just beginning to sort of internalize what it means for trade policy and how it should affect the design of trade negotiations. 20 years ago, we did an agreement on information technology, but we haven't done an agreement on information technology services. 2 years ago in Bali, we concluded the trade facilitation agreement. It's a GATT agreement. There's no counterpart agreement on trade facilitation services, and when you think about it, facilitating trade at the border is almost 99% about services. So we need to think just more intelligently about how to structure negotiations in a manner to exploit the inherent complementarity between goods and services that comes from the value chain revolution we're living through. And of course, you know, negotiators are slow. They're slow. Oh, this is different. I've got to, you know, negotiators are very path-dependent people. I do things the way I used to, the way my grandfather did them. You know, we cut and paste from agreement to agreement. Making breaks, revolutionary breaks in how we do things is very difficult because people are cautious individuals. I'm gonna stop there, and I'm gonna just make one last plea. I had some really interesting stuff that I'm just gonna skip as a collateral victim of the mismanagement of the previous session. But let me make one plea, because this is a REDLAS meeting, and it's not the last one. It's probably the last one to which I'm invited after this talk. But let me make a plea for REDLAS to be focusing on a slightly different topic. You have been obsessed with GVC dynamics now for a number of years, and I think there's still mileage to be made in this field, but I would argue for perhaps a shift of emphasis in terms of research focus. And I think now we are at a time in which globalization is on trial. And jobs, we wonder, where are the jobs going to come from? Jobs are being contested because the labor market is becoming truly global in character, and we have the technological means to outsource more and more and more towards workers who demand less and less in wages and social protection. And at the same time, even in high-paying, high-tech jobs, we're replacing workers with very high wages by robots, by artificial intelligence. Where are the jobs going to go? What are people going to do? And my plea would be to really begin a project, or to go back to the study of the impact of service sector reforms, where 70% of people in most economies work, minimum 70. What is the impact of service sector reforms, including those that are driven by trade, but mostly domestic reforms? What impact do they exert on labor market outcomes? On jobs, on wages, on inequality, on gender, on spatial development between regions, and so on. I think there is a fabulous amount of interesting research to be done, because the main political question of our times, I fear, as we become a bit hostile towards the very idea of trade liberalization and market openness, is driven by concerns over employment. Where am I going to work? Where are my children going to work? How am I going to sustain standards of living? Productivity increases over time. And those are challenging questions in services, and we need fact-based, empirical-based answers to those questions. And so my plea to REDLAS in Costa Rica next year is that some part of the conference, if not all of it, be devoted to this important question. Muchísimas gracias.